So there are moments in life where, once you're done, you sit back and reflect on just how it was that you arrived in that moment in the first place. For me, I had one of those moments a few nights back when I had the chance to sit down and talk with Marco Cappelli from the Storia d'Italia podcast. You see, I could go way back in my life and talk about how I grew up as a kid in Wisconsin, not too far outside of Milwaukee. My life was possibly as local as any one kid's life could be at that time. I remember watching Ferris Bueller's Day Off and watching them run all over Chicago and thinking that felt like a different world to me. In reality, Chicago was less than 100 miles away. I tell you this not to give away my age and let you know that I can actually remember when Ferris Bueller was in movie theaters, but to give you an idea that if Chicago felt far away to me, then Italy may as well have been the moon. Fast forward a few years and I've had the chance to travel around some, but I still have a special place in my heart for the connections I make with people who I never, ever would have dreamt of having a reason to intersect with when I was a kid. Well, jump forward 30 years and now I'm a real boy, living in England and producing this podcast. And it's through that production that I ran into Marco. We both share a love of medieval history, and we both happen to be talking about the 6th century right now. One key difference between the both of us is that he's talking about it in Italian, which I personally think is just him showing off, but seriously, he's 55 episodes into his show, and he's the #1 history podcast in Italy. So it was a tremendous privilege for me to get to steal some of his time and talk about the Goths and the Franks and the Lombards and podcasting in Italy and a whole bunch of other stuff. It was a fun conversation, and his perspective literally helped me to understand things in a new way just during our talk. Anyway, I've rambled on long enough. I'll put all of Marco's social media info on the show notes and also in the recommendations page of thugsandmiracles.com in case you don't get a chance to write it down when we're talking about it on the show. Alright, without further ado, here's a conversation about medieval Europe, Gaul, and Italy, as told between an American guy living in England and an Italian guy living in Belgium. What could possibly go wrong? Enjoy. So, it is good to be able to finally get in touch with you and talk with you. So just to start off, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and also about your podcast so we can learn a little bit more about Marco Cappelli and Storia d'Italia.
Yeah, thank you very much. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I started a podcast, I would say 1.5 years ago, in Italian, which is kind of original in that sense. There are not as many history podcasts in Italian as there are in English, obviously, but which I think is good because it fills a little bit a gap. So my podcast is called Storia d'Italia. It means, surprisingly, the history of Italy. Nobody figured it out already. and it's the first podcast in Italian that tells history in a continuous format, which is the format that I love. So the same one that you are following. So going chronologically from one point, a bit arbitrary onwards. What I chose when I said, okay, I will do the history of Italy, once one could say, okay, you can start with prehistory and then all the Roman history. But I thought that was a bit too much. And I think Roman history is not Italian history, is the history of the whole classical world, the whole Mediterranean, is not just Italy. And also I wanted to track when Rome becomes Italy. So when did Romans stop calling themselves Romans and started calling themselves Italians? At least the Romans that lived in Italy, because of course there were Romans that lived in Gaul, Romans that lived in Iberia, and so forth. So that was what got me going, basically.
Okay, no, and that's something I think is incredibly interesting because, obviously where I pick up with the Franks and what happened in Gaul starts in 476, where we start looking at the fall of the Western Roman Empire insofar as Odoacer having overthrown Romulus at that time. And listening to the history of the Byzantine Empire, which is Robin Pearson does a great job.
Oh, it's fantastic! Really, my favorite, but by a long shot.
Absolutely, and he does this great job of doing it. But he reminds continually that the Roman Empire continued for 1,000 more years.
Yeah.
It wasn't, until Mehmed II went ahead and finally was able to overthrow Constantinople. That this history continued. So I think it's very interesting where you're coming from for Italy, and to talk about the actual peninsula and where the history has started for you. And do you consider 476 to be kind of that starting point, or where would you say you start your history in that sense?
So, of course, it's very hard to answer that question. I think 476 is probably the worst date in that sense, because really nothing happened. It really is the least consequential date that they could possibly choose to talk about the end of the Roman Empire. Because really the Roman state survived in many ways. The Roman state that had been reformed completely changed. So one could say that the end of the old Roman Empire is the crisis of the 3rd century. So you could make that argument, and that there is a new Roman Empire, which will then last until the Arab invasion. And then you have another Roman Empire. So you have different kinds of Roman Empire. So that's a way of seeing it. One way of seeing it is also saying, okay, really the Middle Ages start when the classical world collapses. And I think that's more the 6th century that you are finishing to cover is probably more accurate in terms of the classical world actually collapsing and something new. Well, let's say first the rubble of the old, and then in a few years something new. So that could be another starting point. I personally chose Constantine. Constantine is not very popular today. Was hugely popular through history as the first Christian emperor. So of course, was a rock star for millennia. But Constantine, really, I thought, okay, his history and the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which was really the starting point for me, is the moment when the first element of something different in the identity of the Romans that one day will become Italians. Of course, they didn't become Italians then, but that's when you put the first seed, the Christianity becoming a religion of state. I mean, they say that it didn't at the time of Constantine, but of course it did. So Constantine really was very heavily Christian and Christianized the empire. So I think that I thought that for me, that was a much more meaningful starting point. So narrating the history from that point helps me. But I think the point that you chose for France is as accurate, because that is really the turning point when you have Clovis ascending the throne. And it's really, you could say that France today is really the daughter of Clovis. So you could make that argument, I think, quite easily. So I think that was also very accurate.
I do use 476 in the first episodes, and it's funny as I actually said that, and then I almost had to retract it immediately, because as I went ahead and started looking at that date, I started realizing, well, Clovis actually wasn't in power in 476. It was that predates him by 5 years. So all of a sudden I had to do his father's and the children. And then I just decided, well, let's just start with the Merovingian Empire in the name of Merovic himself. And that took us back to 451.
Yeah, to 450. And you're right. You did also the Battle of the Catalonian Plain, which, by the way, is great. It's just a great story to tell.
It's amazing because, the Roman emperors fighting the Huns with
the help of the Visigoths, and it's such a cool story.
And even then, you also have the formation story of Paris, because you have Saint Genevieve, and she, how she prayed to have Attila go around it. So there's all this history of France that's in there that really didn't actually start, or started well before 476. And then when you get to Clovis, you're talking about 481, and then and then 496 was his Constantine moment.
Yes, when he was. After the battle against the Alemanni, I think, and then he, I covered that in my podcast. So I made, because I try not to tell only the history of Italy. So for me, that's such an important moment for European history, when you have the first barbarian king converting to Catholicism, which really throws down that barrier between the Germanic and the Latin population, allowing them to become one nation in so many ways. So that's such an important step to create France, but also to change the history of religion, to change the history of the European continent. So it's really, really consequential.
Absolutely. Moving then from that point, and it started to draw to where you and I unite inside of our history of, obviously it wasn't the Lombards at this time, but going across to the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and over that way. So it was really Clovis's sons that were coming across to help out and, to fight with the Ostrogoths and fight against, and also collude with, the Ostrogoths and Theodoric. Really, at what point there? I mean, where are you at in your podcast now in that history as far as that time frame? You said you were in the early 6th century, so are you starting to get into that?
Yes. So I basically I have covered the whole history of Theoderic. So I'm around 526 now. So I also had of course, the part with Clovis. There is a very interesting primary source in Italy. So let me first say a few words about what we call the Ostrogothic kingdom, and it's a bit of a misnomer, as well as the Byzantine Empire. So the Byzantine Empire is just a name that we gave the Roman Empire because we didn't know, it confused us. So to talk about this medieval Roman Empire. So a bit the Ostrogothic kingdom in reality is a bit like that. Because it's very different from the Visigothic kingdom and is very different from the Frankish kingdom. And why so? Because the so-called Ostrogothic kingdom, in reality, the entire apparatus of the state is the Roman state. So unlike the Visigothic areas and Gaul, in Italy, the Roman state survived. Italy was never conquered by a Germanic people. Let me explain that. Odoacer was not a conqueror coming from outside. He was a military leader, a Germanic origin, but he, as anybody, by the way, serving the empire at that time, but he just took down the emperor, but basically the entire apparatus of the Roman state survived under Odoacer and then Theoderic. So you had the prefectus of the praetorium, you had the governor of the provinces, you had the magister officiorum, you had all the panoplia of the Roman state, of the late Roman state, so the one reformed by Diocletian. So there's a really big continuum, and there's a big continuum even in the cities. So you have cities that are still fairly large. You have an economy that is still based on cities and trade and international trade, and you even have a fairly good level of culture because the Romans are still in power now. What happens with Theoderic is that he's sent by Zeno, emperor of in Constantinople, the only Roman emperor, because at a certain time he grew tired of Odoacer and he thought he was an usurper. So he said, okay, we need to get rid of Odoacer. And by the way, he also wanted to get rid of Theoderic, so because his gods that were in the east. And so he said, okay, 2 birds with 1 stone. You go there, take care of Odoacer, and you become king in Italy. So, but the title of Theoderic was always king of the Goths and the Italians. And his authority comes from the Roman emperor. Unlike the other kings, his actual authority directly emanates from the emperor that confirms him, which is a double-edged sword, because if your authority comes from somebody else, that somebody else can take it back, which is what will happen. But so that's a very different position. And also the Romans that lived in Italy, they were accustomed to having a Roman emperor, a Western Roman emperor. And by the end of the 5th century, being the Western Roman emperor really meant being the ruler of Italy. That was all that was left of the Western Roman Empire. So they started seeing Theoderic as the Western Roman emperor. And Theoderic wore the purple. He was the only person besides the emperor of Rome that could wear the purple. He had a diadem that was sent back by Constantinople to Ravenna. It was the diadem of the Western Roman emperors. Odoacer sent it to Constantinople. Theoderic managed to have it back from Constantinople. He ruled in Ravenna, in the palace of the emperors. So, and you can tell from the primary sources of the time that people believed he was the Roman emperor. They even called him Augustus several occasions. He could not call himself officially the emperor because that would be a spat in the eye of the Roman emperor in Constantinople.
And that's it's interesting because I didn't realize how powerful the Eastern Roman Empire remained up to this time, because even with Clovis, what we were saying there, he also did receive from the Byzantine Empire in the Eastern Roman Empire, a purple robe and a diadem, but was never, exactly, but was never ever considered to be an emperor in and of himself. But he was. There's some they talk about whether or not he called himself Augustus, and that was maybe a self-styled thing. But again, like you said, he was never truly the person in charge of the entire empire. He did have one thing that the Italians did not, though, and that was just the tyranny of distance. And he was far enough away that there was no way the Byzantines were going to be able to mount an attack.
No.
Whereas obviously we go a couple years further into your history and we start getting into quite a bit of, and Justinian.
Yeah, the Gothic War. So, and this is what you mentioned about 508. This is very interesting. And it's a very clear episode if you look at the history of the relationship between Theoderic and then the next emperor after Zeno is Anastasius. So what happens is that Theoderic at a certain point, let's not go into many details, but he basically pisses off Anastasius because he gets a couple of cities in the Balkans that really Anastasius thought belonged to him. Theoderic thought belonged to the Western Empire. By the way, the Italians were super rejoiced that, the Roman Empire has reconquered a province. They didn't say the Ostrogoth, the Ostrogothic kingdom has recovered a province. They said the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, has recovered a province. That's what Cassiodorus, Boetius, and Nodius, these are the main authors of the time, say. So basically, Anastasius was really pissed at Theoderic, but he did not have maybe the inclination or the strength to really strike at Theoderic at that time. We're talking about Theoderic at the maximum of his power. So what he did, Anastasius, he did a political maneuver to ally with Clovis. And when there was the big war, the Great War of 507, that really many think is the first European war, the first war between European powers, he recognized Clovis as a consul, an honorary consul, not an actual Roman consul. Because, by the way, this is another funny thing. Roman consuls are still being named every year. So 2 consuls, one for the West, one for the East. And who gets to name the one for the West? Of course, Theoderic, because he's the Western Roman emperor. Not in name, but in everything else. So basically, it's a kind of a spat in the eye of back to Theoderic, saying, I can give the honors I gave you, I can give also to somebody else. And when you give an honor to more people, the value is like the currency. If you print more currency, then the value of the currency decreases. So it was a way of saying, I can give it to anybody I want, and that means that you're not so special after all. So it was a bit that, but yes, also Clovis at the time of 508, clearly Clovis is in many regards the same power as Theoderic in the West. So these are the 2 great powers left, basically.
Yes, absolutely. And then so moving into that area, so one of the key differences here was the religious aspect of these 2 groups. And I'm always shocked, I don't know why, but how minor really the religious difference truly is as far as, Arianism and Catholicism was concerned at that time. But it was certainly enough to launch wars. How did the emperor in the East deal with the fact that the Ostrogoth, or as we're in the Western Roman Empire, the Ostrogothic, Theodoric was not a Catholic.
So the funny thing is that also Anastasius was not a Catholic. So let's explain, because it's complicated. If you think that the difference between Arians and let's say Nicaeans is small, the difference within the Nicene Creed, there is a difference between the Monophysites, I don't know in English, but yeah, and the Chalcedonians. Comes from the Council of Chalcedon. It's really splitting hair. Probably it's not very interesting for people to know. Just know that there is a difference. Basically, the Chalcedonians believe that there were two natures in Christ, in Jesus Christ, and the Monophysites, they thought they were one nature, God and human together, fused in one. And that's even more hair splitting. But that was really important at the time, because this went back to the identity of people. And sure enough, Anastasius was not a Chalcedonian. So he tried to manage, let's say, he officially used, let's say, something called the Dianoticon, which kind of tried to say, this thing doesn't matter. But this was not liked by the West. In the West, there were no Monophysites. Everybody that was Nicene was Chalcedonian. So if you understand what I mean, so everybody in the let's say Catholic camp was Chalcedonian. So they didn't care about these Monophysites from the East, and they really didn't like Anastasius. And the Pope was in schism with the Patriarch of Constantinople. So in reality, at the time of Clovis, he was the only ruler in the world that was Chalcedonian. So that's a very big deal. So going back to your question, because I want to answer it. So Theoderic was Arian, but Theoderic really pushed in Italy a policy of tolerance. So he said, and by the way, this extended also to Jews. So the very big tolerance, saying anybody is welcome. We cannot. There's even a letter. He wrote a letter to the Jewish community saying we cannot force religion to people. So everybody has to profit, which is incredibly modern and was completely out of touch with that time. But of course he was doing it because he was an Arian, a minority within a majority. So I'm not saying that he was doing only because of his good art, okay? So his policy, for example, in Ravenna, in the capital, was to build a cathedral for the Arians and a cathedral for the Orthodox, and say there's space for everybody. Let's just not get hung on this, you do, I respect you, you respect my faith, and I will respect yours. And so that was kind of a dynamic within Italy. It would become a big deal towards the end of Theodoric kingship, because he slipped a bit. Maybe we can cover that, I don't know. But for the majority of his kingdom, there was an acceptance of his Arianism, and it was considered not a big deal in Italy, even to the point that Theoderic was the arbiter to decide a pope. So when there was an election of a pope, this was in, I think, 498. So basically the two popes were elected, and they didn't know what to do. And they said, okay, let's just ask Theoderic, Arian king. And he decided who would be the Catholic pope.
That's awesome. That's... you almost wish you could have an outside party for things like this nowadays, in situations, of that magnitude. But it does show that, that really Theodoric is one that he astounds me as a leader, because he was so dynamic in that sense, and he was able to keep things together. And he really did. He reached out. One of the things in Frankish history is the fact that they never did actually get, in the time of Theodoric, all the way to the Mediterranean. When you look at the Empire of Clovis, he got all the way down to Septimania, but he was never able to get that land bridge that ran between the Ostrogoths. And I was always very impressed by the fact that the Ostrogothic kingdom was able to keep its ties in the Gothic kingdom, really, across all the way, and maintain. And I always wondered how history might have been different had the Franks been able to get to the Mediterranean Sea, and if they would have been able to get additional support from the Byzantine Empire for later on. It was some of the battles that went, when we start talking about the Gothic Wars later on, if they've been able to open a second front instead of having to go all the way up the boot, and fight and really slog it through. So I find it, he's an incredible leader, and I actually had the chance to go to Ravenna and
you saw how magnificent that art is. It's just it's breathtaking. It's really like it's incredible, And it's incredible today. But then when you add that it's 1,000 years older than most things you will see as piece of art today in a church, it's astonishing.
Yes, it is. So turning real fast to maybe a little bit beyond where you're at right now, but going into where you want to take the podcast in the next few episodes, maybe depending on how detailed you are, maybe a lot of episodes, because the Gothic Wars are certainly a period of interest. But I'd be remiss because of the Frankish interactions inside of Italy during that time frame and how they went and worked with the Eastern Roman Empire and then turned their back on the Eastern Roman Empire. And ultimately led to the Lombards being able to come across, when all is said and done. I do know we're probably stepping ahead about 50 years from where you're at now.
No, but I know this story. So this is an interesting thing to say, that, and you say that very clearly, that probably at the time of Theodoric and Clovis, if somebody would have made a bet, so okay, what would be the biggest and baddest power 100 years from now? I think they would have bet on the the kingdom of Theodoric, the Ostrogothic kingdom, as you want to call it, and they would be wrong, of course. So that's why I think Clovis at the end is more important as in the long term of history is more important than Theodoric. Although you probably figured out that I like him quite a bit. But so what happens with the Gothic War is that it's the most. I calculated that for me is the most destructive war that has ever happened on the peninsula, and we've seen a few.
One or two.
So it's the most destructive because the peninsula had survived late antiquity. I wouldn't say unscathed, but really with the entire, you had the circus working, the amphitheaters and the aqueducts and the Roman roads. It was not top notch, but it was still there. And then you have this war, which Justinian started basically a bit because he had an opportunity, as you said, with Amalasuntha dying, and there was a good opening, and he had just had this fantastically fast Vandalic war that said, okay, these kingdoms of the West are not really tough. I got the Vandals, I can get the Goths too. And he was wrong. Boy, he was wrong. So the Goths were not weak. And it took 20 incredibly destructive years. Of course, then you have the plague. Imagine you have the plague that the Justinian plague that killed probably 30% of the population. In Italy, it was probably even worse, because while it hit during the worst times of the war. So when you have a war, usually you have people that have malnutrition, so they are they are more weak. Probably the death rate, we don't know, but probably the death rate was higher than even higher than in the East. So you have the combination of the war, the last 20 years with siege that continuously, cities are taken back and forth and razed to the ground multiple times. Milan is razed to the ground. Rome, there's at a certain point during the Gothic War, there's 500 people left in Rome. During Theodoric, the lowest estimate is 150,000. The higher estimate is 400,000. It was still a huge city for the time. And it's a complete devastation. So had not this war happened, who knows? Maybe the future would have been slightly different. Some would say maybe the Franks had some very good arrows on to shoot. They were much more militaristic. They were, I think, the biggest advantage they had, that combination with the local population, which happened much faster than in Ostrogothic Italy, because there was no religion barrier. So the religion barrier is very important. It was very important at the time for the identity. So, for example, during the Lombard time, when the Lombards converted to Catholicism, at a certain point, just a few years later, everybody was calling themselves Lombard. So the formerly known, former Romans called themselves Lombard. So I think that would have happened also with Goths and Italo-Romans had they had more time first, and if there wasn't the religious barrier, and the religion barrier honestly would have fallen, I think, like it happened to the Visigoths. They converted to Catholicism. The Lombards converted to Catholicism. So I think over time, probably Theoderic couldn't do it as he was the first king, but I think 2-3 generations down the road they would have converted. So it's kind of, it's funny how history goes sometimes, but you can't say how history would have gone, but it's very interesting to see how there were really two big powers, and then after the Gothic War, really in the West there was only one left, and was the Franks.
And one thing I find interesting in this conversation that I'm now kind of actually thinking about more, even as we're just talking, is the idea that while Theodoric seems like he was able to go ahead and really make something almost beautiful, in so far as what he built and what he left in Ravenna. When you go walk around there, you still see the Arian baptistries, and you still see his tomb and what was left behind. When you compare that to what was left in Frankish culture, there really wasn't anything. Yeah. So yeah. It's interesting to say that the Franks, and to paraphrase what you were saying earlier, were ultimately the more important culture, or that Clovis was somehow the more important ruler, historically speaking, when really what he left behind, as far as any type of physical infrastructure, was
nothing.
They're really just a brute force.
Yeah, they were thugs, no? Like
exactly. It makes for a great title, doesn't it?
And this is a big difference, because in a way, the Frankish kingdom is already in the Middle Ages, and the Theoderic's kingdom is still in the late antiquity. They are living side by side, but it's almost like they're in two different times. The Lombards are definitely in the Middle Ages, but the Gothic kingdom really isn't. It's still, for Italy, is still, like the Byzantine Empire, by the way, is still in the late antiquity time. The Byzantine Empire really will stay in the late antiquity until the Arab conquest, so a bit longer even. But so that's kind of. But at the end, thugs sometimes win. So,
it really did. It took, almost another 300-400 years before we get to the Carolingian Renaissance, and Charlemagne, and really actually starting to have something that transcends just physically owning the space. And I can see you want to say so.
Yeah, I will tell you one little detail that I think you will love about the Carolingians. So when Charlemagne conquered Ravenna, in Ravenna, there was still a statue made by Theoderic of him on a horse in bronze. This is probably the last statue made with the ancient technique of bronze making that was lost then for 1,000 years. So this was an incredibly beautiful piece of art that nobody at the time of Charlemagne could do. And of course, what he did, he transported it to Aachen, to Aquisgrana, and he transported also a few columns of Theoderic's palace to make his palace and his church, which still stands today. So because for him, that Ravenna, that was the Roman Empire. And he was trying to make a new imperial capital. So of course, he took some pieces of it. And I tell you another little detail that I found in the recent research, that then some Vikings visited probably the statue, which, imagine you are coming from Sweden, modern day Sweden, you arrive in Aquisgrana, you see this statue that seems like from another world. Imagine they had never seen anything like it. So, and it really must have struck them, because when they came back, they wrote a poem in runic on a stone, which, by the way, is the first piece of Swedish literature. So it survives. So I'm sure there were others, but it's the first one that survives written, and it talks about Theoderic the Great that ruled in the Rio Marar, so in the Mediterranean Sea, and now stands in the city of the emperors, and with the sword, with the lance in the hand, and all very Viking. And so I was thinking, oh, that's cool. That's a really cool story.
No, I love stuff like that, and it just, I mean, you mentioned the Vikings, and I understand. Yes, now we have television series and everything else, but to really go back and find the history of how all these different cultures, and to be the Vikings coming from the north. You mentioned the Arabs earlier coming from the south, and how everything kind of came together to make modern day Europe
Yes.
and really the world. The Western world. I shouldn't say the whole world because
Yeah.
obviously Asia and whatnot. But it's no. I think that those stories are, if you when you get the true foundational texts that tell you this is when we came to Aachen and we saw the statue as you're talking about. That's amazing to know that somebody wrote it down and it somehow survived.
It survives in a stone in Sweden that talks
Yeah.
about somebody visiting Aachen of a statue that they knew. They knew it was from from Theoderic on the Mediterranean Sea. I think it's just great. We think sometimes about the High Middle Ages as this world that is so small that there is no connection between the parts. But there are connections, of course. And I totally agree with you. This is the Western. We're seeing the West as a civilization being born under our eyes. I mean, the real West is the successor of the classical civilization. The classical civilization, of course, and which means that it is influenced by the classical civilization, but it's something different. And to really understand how the West was born, yes, you have to study the Greeks and the Romans, but you also have to look at this period because here under our eyes, the nation that still make up Europe and then will influence, have such an oversized influence on the history of the world are being born.
I agree. Well, tell you what, where do you think you're going with with your podcast now? One thing I've noticed personally with mine is that as I've gone along, I was able to almost do a king an episode, and that was kind of my original format. I was going to go through just a king and maybe have 88 episodes by the time I was able to get all the way to 17. The 1790s and the French Revolution, and I've started to realize it now. I've actually gone almost 25 episodes, and I've barely gotten out of the 6th century. And I'm actually just now doing the research for the things that are happening in 601 to 613. And so, how do you think your podcast is going to progress? Do you plan on going at that pace, or do you have a certain period of time that you're really hoping to get to and then really focus on, or how do you feel?
It's very difficult. I had the same experience. At the beginning, I had these grand ideas. The first book I bought was The Wars of Procopius. I said, yeah, I will do it will take a few episodes and I will get to this. It took 55 episodes. so I had the same experience as you. I think if you want to give justice, so there's several ways of doing this. You can do it a bit faster by cutting on the details, but then it's very hard to understand what's going on. The other risk is getting bogged down in the story, where you make one episode for a little detail, and then the story gets bogged down. So you want to advance as well. I think I like this space I'm doing now. It's basically, it takes me 30 episodes to do a century. That's my rule, more or less. If I can do one century in 30 episodes, I'm fine. Because I think I also need to have a few episodes that are thematic, like, the church or or you have to do things that are not just chronological. Otherwise, it's just a battle, king, killed the other king and so on. So I like this space also because it gives me time to research, as you probably are feeling.
Yes. Yeah.
Because you need time to research the stuff you're going to talk afterwards. Yes. And if you want to give it justice, you need to spend months, to research for a period of time. I mean, I'm not talking about 10 years, but when you talk about a 50 years period, it takes months. I think. I mean, it takes to me months to research. So if I don't have those months, because I'm catching up, then I can't produce with the quality that I want the podcast. So I like this space. I will try not to get bogged down, because right now, for example, I'm looking at the Gothic War. And I have so much details from Procopius that I don't have for other periods of history, that I have really the fear that it will take me many episodes. But at the same time, I'm a bit lucky, because then after Procopius, I don't have a lot of primary sources to base to base on for a very long time. So maybe it's worth splurging a few episodes on that.
I fully understand where you're coming from. Yeah, because I mean, I've realized how much I've slowed down on. So certainly, as I gotten into what I find to be really an interesting period with the two queens of Fredegunda and Brunhilde, and I've spent so much time on them that as I'm pushing past that and I'm going towards Charlemagne, I can probably get to the next 150, 200 years relatively quickly and talk about the mayors of the palace and the general themes and the decline of the Merovingians. But then when I hit Charlemagne and all of a sudden there's going to be this huge body of literature that's available, I'm just, I'm excited.
It's a great story. So maybe it's worth to slow down the pace there, right? It's a story that needs to be told in a way. So
it laid the groundwork for everything
to slow down there. As I was saying, you hit something that is really interesting. It's worth other stuff. I'm not saying you have to skim over them, but you can have a more, faster pace when not so much is happening, or not so, maybe it's happening. A lot of things are happening, but they are repeating themselves a bit. So
exactly. And that's, I'm with you on that one. I always get worried about the repetitiveness of civil war conflict. This brother doesn't like this brother, and just it does bog down at some point. So in finding those hidden gems, and that's what I know for myself I want to do, because really the whole reason I got into the podcast was the fact that even though I have French heritage, as my grandfather and whatnot, I never spent any time in American schools worrying about anything in European history outside of the very big, the Magna Carta and
a bit of English history, right?
Exactly,
but not much more.
So, and I want to go back and find those things that, can really, and I find this to be an incredibly fascinating topic that has, so many books and so many other stories have driven out of that. And I guess that's my final question for you. I found, as I mentioned, stories. I found that my way of telling the story in the podcast is to open up with almost a story that I'm writing myself. Yeah. And I feel okay with taking the liberty to do that, because as I've been reading Gregory Tour in particular, it's very obvious that he wrote stories about events that happened 50 to 100 years before his lifetime, that there's no way he could have known the details of what happened. And it's just so dramatic that we're using it as a historical source in the first, as a primary source, but realistically, there's no way that it could have been until he gets much later into it. And so I'm taking some amount of liberty in writing those stories, and then trying to go after the story is done to get into the nuts and bolts of the actual history itself, to talk about, how I came to that an opening sequence. Mm-hmm. How do you go about, with your episodes? And I do apologize because you speak
you
English and
Italian, so
I can listen. I just won't do any good. But
so I don't tell a story, but I do have, let's say a starting. Maybe I try to make it really short, like 2-3 minutes, and say, this is what we are going to talk about. And with with a few words where you say, okay, this is the most important thing that happens, but without spoiling too much what happens, so that then it's a bit like you are doing it as a slightly different style, because you create really the story and the people. I have more like a person from 1,000 miles looking down to the story. Kind of style, but the technique is the same, because at the end, if you think that the story you're telling is something worth knowing, then you want also to capture the attention, and not lose it immediately. So you want to get that, and then usually I start with the most boring part after that. So if I have like, let's say 3-4 topics I have to go through, the most boring is the first one after the music, the first, the beginning. So I say, okay, I probably gained a little bit of credence at the beginning, so they will go through this with me until we get to the more interesting stuff.
Well, and I think it's all interesting. Well, tell you what, it's been a pleasure talking to you this evening. It's been a pleasure finding out, knowing that, because again, from my perspective, there's plenty of us over here in the English world who are babbling on about everything that's going on. And, we can go through the Dan Carlins and the Mike Duncans and everybody else. But to know that you're out there, and providing this in the Italian language and everything else. When I do finally, I've been working on my French, obviously, to be able to stay abreast of what I'm reading in the French literature for this. When I finally get around to, improving my Italian, I will be certain to use yours as a
source.
As a source to.
So I would like to say to your readers, if somebody is curious and wants to pay a visit to my website, I actually publish also the text of the podcast. I'm behind about like 15, 20 episodes behind the actual podcast. And those are very easy to click translate on your Google. So if you're curious after this and you want to know more about Theoderic, about the Battle of Adrianople, the Catalonia Fields battle, and many other things between Constantine and the 6th century, then you can do that. If you want to learn Italian, you can also give it a try. If you know a bit of Italian, you can improve it.
Poco.
But I really wanted to talk to you just because it's rare to have two podcasters, history podcasters, that are covering the early Middle Ages. There are not so many podcasts, and I thought, that's really interesting. We can have, and we had a really nice conversation on these topics, and opening each other's eyes on this period.
No, and it's, I honestly, and the final thought I have is that I think it's very interesting, obviously from a different language, you have a different perspective, and from being from Italy, but, there's the French history podcast, and Gary Giroux, who's also, he's just now entering into this. He chose to go all the way back literally to prehistory and the beginning of the world with, how and that's awesome. That's something I didn't do. And so everybody having their own take on the original sources, I feel like you can listen to all these different podcasts side by side and still gain something. And actually maybe even have more enjoyment because you already kind of know what's going to happen, and you can build on that knowledge base. So it's definitely, it's a great experience. Just for everybody listening, what is your podcast that obviously your podcast in your website?
Okay, so it's called Storia d'Italia, written Storia, d'Italia, d'Italia. I think everybody knows how to write that. And the website is Italia Storia. So Italia and then Storia.com. And there you have the text. I have the sources, some maps. I bit like your website. I really like it's well done. So I have all those sources there. And of course, there's all the links to, and I am on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, always with Italia Storia at the end, facebook.com/Italia Storia, and you find me.
Well, it sounds great. I will go ahead and I will make sure to put those links up on my website. So I appreciate your kind words on there. And we'll go make sure that we have everybody know exactly what you're talking about and have the opportunity to see your website and your work and learn Italian, and it'd be great. So again, real pleasure, and I will talk to you soon, my friend.
Thank you very much, man.
Okay, huge thanks once again to Marco Cappelli of the Storia d'Italia podcast for taking time out to talk with us. It's just fun to talk to smart people with a passion for their subject, and Marco obviously has both of those traits in spades. For more Marco, check out his website at italiastoria.com. His transcripts are all up there in Italian, and Google Translate does a pretty good job of allowing us to pull those over to English or whatever your language of choice is pretty easily. As you heard me saying to Marco toward the end of the interview, this is a pretty cool tool that could be used for anyone looking to learn Italian and who's also a history buff. Having him speaking the language while we can follow along with the transcript is really, really useful. Beyond his website, you can find Marco on all of the usual social media sites, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Italia Storia, which is spelled ITALIASTORIA. Please follow him, listen to him, and reach out to him. He's one of the smartest and most approachable people that I've had the pleasure to talk to recently, and I know he's happy to engage with anyone who wants to get medieval. As for Thugs, as always, the music used for the show comes from Josh Woodward and includes his songs Bully and Lafayette. For a free download of these songs or hundreds of other great tracks, check out his site at joshwoodward.com. Notes for all of our episodes, transcripts, lists of sources, a monarchy/family tree, and also a list of other great history podcast recommendations are all available online at thugsandmiracles.com. Be sure to sign up for the free email list so I can keep you up to date with all things T&M and announcements on new shows and future interviews. Speaking of email, you can write to me at thugsandmiracles@gmail.com. You can hit me on Twitter at thugsandmiracle with no S on the end, or you can leave a comment on Facebook and Instagram at thugsandmiracles. As always, we love reviews and ask that if you're enjoying the show that you please take a moment and put up 5 stars on your podcast player of choice or tell a friend. Word of mouth helps us grow. Okay, once again, thanks to Marco Cappelli at Storia d'Italia. My name is Benjamin Bernier, and I look forward to seeing you in just 10 more days as we move back into the world of Brunhilde and Clothar II and the 7th century as we get into our next episode of Thugs and Miracles.